Hey, Dave Langer, how's it going?
Good, Joe. How you doing?
Good, good. Long time no see.
Yeah, exactly.
Just kidding. So we do this. We do a, monthly show for what is it, LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live and a few other things. So it's a lot of fun. But yeah. I figured we'd catch up, see what you've been up to lately, and we always have interesting conversations. So I have no idea where it's going to go. So
Me neither. That's all. It's just going to be fun. That's all I know.
cool. Yeah. So yeah, what have you been up to lately?
So, as I've posted on social media before, I'm a relatively newly minted solopreneur. Started it back in August. I was a victim of the downturn in the economy. I worked for a small startup. I got let go, and I figured it was time for me to start my own thing, which I'd been planning on doing for a while. So lately, I've been building my latest online course, which is an introduction to machine learning using R in the Tidy Models package from the Tidyverse, which is going to be released later this month in February. So that's basically been what I've been working on a lot. And then of course the social media thing, the Data Heretics live thing with you, and various other kinds of things, but really buckling down on building slides, recording slides, editing videos, getting ready for my launch on the 24th of Feb.
That's cool. Congrats. Yeah, I've noticed you've been cranking out a lot of content.
Yeah, well, I do like to create content.
I can't.
So I do.
Didn't know that.
Yeah,
So,
I do like to create content. I consider it, even though I don't work in a quote unquote traditional creative space, I do see this as very much a creative endeavor. If you've ever written a piece of code or if you've ever been a software engineer, you know that writing code is there's art to it. You craft code. There's definitely an artistic element to it. There's good code and bad code, and you know it when you see it, but there's no way you can quantify why this code is good and why this code is bad. So it's very artistic. And I feel the same thing about analytics in general and the stuff that I create. So for example, I really do love writing LinkedIn posts. I do craft them. I do them usually in Word, and I worry about the words and the letter counts and all that kind of stuff. So I really do see it as a creative process, and I really do enjoy it. So I think folks that are in the space should definitely follow your lead and my lead, and don't be afraid to create content. Don't be afraid to be artistic and express yourself, either LinkedIn, YouTube, GitHub, whatever, or all three. Do whatever you like.
yeah, I mean, and it's kind of cool. I mean, you invested in your brand, I think, very early on too. I mean, while you had a day job, I noticed that your follower counts, for example, were just astronomical for especially somebody in our space. It's you're not Kim Kardashian, but you know, uh, I mean, but you have a following, right? And so, I mean, was that intentional? I mean, how did you go about building like such a, I guess, a big and loyal following?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And hopefully I've been transparent all along. And I do write posts periodically, for example, on LinkedIn about this. So how I first got my start in social media was on my YouTube channel. And I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because I think it's germane to the question. So back in 2014, I was steeped in going up the learning curve of advanced analytics. I had finished up my master's degree, where that master's degree had introduced me to machine learning. And I had been in BI and data warehousing and traditional analytics for a long time. And then once I learned machine learning, I was like, oh my God, this is the stuff. Oh, I can take my data warehouse and my data assets, and it's like a crystal ball. So I was, of course, like, I got the machine learning hammer and every
Hmm.
problem's a nail. So a buddy of mine said, hey, you should really record some videos about what you're learning and how you're doing it because people will find it interesting. So just on a whim, I created some YouTube videos. That first video is well over 1 million views now.
Hmm.
So it's been around for a long time, and that was my start. And I did it for a little bit. When I worked at a company called Data Science Dojo, which was a job that I had after I left Microsoft, that's when I discovered a book called Micro Mavens, which was really a book about personal brand based businesses. There's like Gary Vee, for example, was one of the personages exposed in the book about like, hey, you can use social media, you can do content marketing, you can create a brand, and if you build up a sufficient following that are loyal to you, like what you do, you can eventually turn that into a business. So this was almost 4 years ago now, and I read that book and I was absolutely fascinated with it. And that's when I really started focusing on content marketing, doing meetups at Data Science Dojo to help Data Science Dojo create some brand in the social media space. I started posting a lot on LinkedIn, and those were the glory days where, not to brag or anything, because it is more of a function of the time than of me, but like posts would regularly get 300, 400,000 views.
What?
And, oh yeah. So
That's
LinkedIn back then,
insane.
yeah, because it was an influx of a few things. LinkedIn was relatively new as a social media platform back then. Um, it wasn't necessarily really super popular with influencers because they were more on Twitter and Facebook at that point. And also it was the confluence of everyone was getting into data science at that point. So if you were posting about data science on LinkedIn, it was this kind of cricket space in a way. So it was very easy to get like maximal views. So I started building my brand that way back in the day. And then I had to take a break for some legal reasons that I won't go into. And then I came back and hit it. And I knew that all along I wanted to build up this brand because my eventual plan was to try and do what I'm doing now, which is
Right.
start a personal brand based lifestyle business around training because I really like to teach. That's what I really like to do.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are now.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, and it seems like you have a good cadence too of pushing out content. Like I just watched the new stuff coming out all the time. I mean, how has it been in terms of refining your workflow for, I guess, coming up with an idea and eventually shipping it?
Yeah. So a lot of my content, especially anything in the past year or two, is really been based on a shift in my perception and my focus of things, and it's all based on my personal professional experience, which is really around this idea of, you know what, machine learning is great, it's super cool, yes, AI, all that stuff, it's the future, guaranteed. And and for most organizations, their biggest bang for their buck isn't deploying a machine learning model or spinning up an AI data science team. It's really around this idea of like, look, we have all these data assets that we've been investing in building for years now, and we have all these people that don't really know how to use all that data effectively. So
Right.
my content has really been focused around. I mean, there's this, even before I knew it was a thing. There's this data literacy movement. I kind of stumbled onto that after I came to this kind of epiphany thing. um, so I grabbed onto it, right? You know, I got no shame. I grabbed onto the data literacy thing. I did because it suited my nefarious purposes. But it's really that's really that idea that, look, in this new world, in this new world of data, companies awash in data, you really need everybody, almost everybody, reasonably proficient with data, and you can get disproportionate results if you have data literate workforces. And the thing is that professionals of all stripes can develop valuable data skills. It's not as complicated as people want it to make it out to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're like, I don't know, let's say you're an HR professional and you get on LinkedIn and you start following hashtag data science and hashtag this and that, what you're going to see is an overwhelming amount of stuff around deep neural networks, computer vision
Right.
type things, all that kind of stuff, and gradient descent and back propagation and all that kind of stuff. And you're going to be like, whoa, okay, obviously if this is what analytics is, I can't do it. And I wanted to kind of say, look, there's a different point of view. It says relatively few simple techniques can actually get you disproportionate value. And you know what? You can do them in Excel. You can do it with a little bit of R. You don't really need anything fancy. So I'm really trying to target those kinds of folks and bring them into the data fold, as it were.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really smart move too, especially given that, what is it, like, Excel is definitely the most popular language out there, if you want to call it. I mean, what, 750 million Excel users or something crazy number?
Something
I
like
think
that.
it's probably more, especially start including stuff like, Google Sheets and other types of spreadsheet applications. It's just the spreadsheet it's a lingua franca of data. So,
Yeah, and as I posted not too long ago, because just on a lark, uh, I looked it up because I'm a computer scientist by background and in academic training as well, and it turns out that Excel is actually Turing complete. Microsoft is now apparently engaging in a formal process to make it Turing complete, but it's actually just formulas in worksheets makes it Turing complete. So not only is it the world's most popular analytical software, it's also the world's most popular programming language by far.
Yeah, I saw it the other month. They added lambdas to it, which is just a function, right? But still, that's pretty cool. I mean, finally, after all these years. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's like Excel is sort of the gateway drug to being a better data professional, and you're right too. I know in my experience, like when companies have a data literate workforce, especially data literate leadership, like it's night and day. I think you can get a lot done, in your data maturity. Conversely, if you don't have data literacy, I don't know how data science is going to work in an organization like that.
Yeah, and I 100% agree. And that's also, not only was it the target market, I mean, I'm not going to lie, right? If you're going to start a business and you're looking at 700 million potential customers, you're like, that's pretty interesting. But you've hit on an even more important, arguably, idea, which is if you're going to get leadership that's data literate, you have to make it as simple as possible for them, right? They're busy, you don't know what their backgrounds are, and the last thing that you want to do is start throwing, multivariate calculus formulas at them. You're just going to lose your audience. So saying, look, you can become data literate and all you need is Excel to do it is extremely powerful.
So what's like the learning curve from somebody who's maybe an Excel user? They might know what a pivot table is, maybe not. But what's the progression that you've seen from somebody from maybe a pretty standard spreadsheet background to becoming proficient in analytics and data literacy using Excel?
And this is not theory because I've done it with folks that I've worked with in previous roles. It's not all that complicated, especially if you pick the right tools. For example, and I'll just take two examples. So in Excel with the analysis tool pack, you can do linear regression relatively easy. Right? So click interface. Now to use that, you still need to know some stuff, right? You need to know about the OLS assumptions. You need to know how to interpret some of the output. It's not particularly difficult, but you could say, look, I'm going to use a spectrum. I'm going to make this like the hard end of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And then on the other end of the spectrum is a tool like a process behavior chart, which is actually a rebranding of what's known as a XMR control chart for process control. Now, relatively speaking, to use this effectively, you need to know even less than you need to use the analysis toolpack for linear regression. This is really easy. If you can add, subtract, multiply, and if you know the difference between an average and a median, you're good to go. Because the great thing about like the process behavior chart is that, and this has been shown by folks in the statistical process control community, is that it works for basically any number of arbitrary distributions. So it's almost essentially distribution independent, which means that it's wildly useful for all kinds of things. So the barrier to actually understanding how to use that tool to conduct analysis is extremely small. And you can build those charts in Excel very easily. So, and then you can do things like you can do statistical significance tests across groups. I mean, it's like you can do some powerful statistical stuff and you really don't have to worry about all the kinds of things that you normally do with traditional frequentist statistics. So it's very, very low bar of entry.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny too, the data analysis tool pack, I mean, that's like this hidden gem in Excel that still a lot of people who I know have been using Excel for a really long time don't even know it exists, which is kind of shocking, but maybe I shouldn't be surprised.
Well, and it's a great point. And there's a lot of powerful visualizations that you can do in Excel that in my 20 plus year career, I have very rarely seen in workbooks. Like you can do box plots, for example. Mm-hmm. Now, granted, box plots aren't a panacea in terms of data visualization, but it is quite sophisticated in terms of the analyses that you could do. And those are relatively easy to understand and they're very easy to build in Excel, but for some reason, you just don't see them.
Right. That's interesting. And then I would say, what are some other skills in Excel that would make somebody probably more data proficient?
Yeah, so I have like a little framework that I've built up over time based on my experience for essentially creating a data literate professional, something that I've branded the citizen business analyst because I I stole that from this article from years ago called the Citizen Data Scientist.
Oh yeah, I remember that
Yeah.
term.
And essentially it says, look, you need four things to do this, and you can do them all on Excel. You can, so process behavior charts, very easy to understand, very easy to build and use. Linear regression using the analysis tool pack. Uh, More advanced data visualizations, things like um, box plots, color coded scatter plots, the kinds of things you normally don't see in Excel workbooks, but you commonly see people that use R and Python in the machine learning space use as part of their data exploratory and visualization techniques, as well as Tableau and Power BI as well, of course.
Right.
Um, that's the third thing. And then the fourth thing is logistic regression, which you can implement in Excel quite easily using the solver. Now, if you have those four things, think about it. You've got the two most widely used predictive algorithms, linear regression, logistic regression. You got data viz. Everybody knows about data viz these days. And then lastly, you have the mighty process behavior chart, which people aren't necessarily super familiar with, but is like wildly useful in so many business analytics scenarios. And if you have all four of those, the ability to do all four of those, just in Excel, you can do all kinds of things. And the things that you can do are broadly applicable: HR, finance, marketing, customer service, IT operations, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really easy for an Excel person with almost no technical background or no technical background to develop those skills and actually start conducting really powerful analyses. And my hope is that once they see how easy that is, they're like, well, wait a second, maybe I need more than that.
Right.
Then it's like, okay, cool. We have SQL, we have R after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw recently too. Was it a Excel had like a Jupyter notebook plugin or something like that? So
Yeah.
that was pretty interesting. Um, I think I personally had mixed feelings on it, but I think I overall like the idea, just because I mean, it's interesting, right? I think if you're a data scientist, you look at spreadsheets as sort of oh, that's for other people. I personally wish more data scientists would learn to use spreadsheets. It would make their life a lot easier. Because what I see typically is like data scientists will fire up a data frame to do a total on like a few columns. And I'm like, you could have just done that in a spreadsheet or
Or in a
SQL,
SQL query.
right? But
Or in a SQL query. Yeah.
yeah.
I 100% agree. And as I've written about on LinkedIn, I'm an old school software engineer and IT guy. So I look down on Excel as the bane of my existence because it was so prevalent in the business side of the house. And it's not a reproducible, it's not necessarily a maintainable solution. I think you and I've talked about this, and this probably resonate with you, Joe, given your background. But when I worked at a property and casualty insurance company, the actuarial department, they ran everything on these bitchin' powerful workbooks with tons of VBA and macros and formulas like all over the place. And that's how they ran what they did. And so I always looked down on Excel because I was like, look, there's no software engineering involved in that. But then later on, as I flipped over to the analytics space, and I'm like, look, I got to help the business make money or save money. And I'm like, Excel is it. This is the thing. You know what? It is a great tool. There's a reason why there's 750 million Excel users worldwide.
Right. But it's also the craziness too of Excel. Like, I do know what you're saying, especially with these. Uh, it's interesting. I mean, because these businesses will build these giant monolithic reports that are all tied together, and kind of duct tape with VBA and macros and Lord knows what else. I mean, I think it was a really popular paradigm, especially in the 2000s. Before I think you had better kind of architectures to offload that stuff, but you still see this pretty often. Um, I mean, how is that something you address too? Is kind of maybe design patterns for Excel reports? See,
Me personally, no, I haven't gone that far. What I try to do is essentially, I'm okay. I'm going to be completely honest here. Okay. I'm using Excel as my gateway drug. Right.
mm-hmm.
I'm going to be, okay. You can do all these analyses in Excel, and eventually I'm going to get you hooked. Right. And then, cool. We move you to SQL, we move you to a language like R, and then say, look, at that point, you have the ability to do more software engineering kinds of things to make things more reproducible and actually have patterns. So I've kind of taken the attitude of like, I'm going to work with Excel the way business people think about it. And instead of fighting it, I'm just going to embrace it and then maybe do a little judo on it, trying to like use its own momentum against it, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, I think it's just called Excel hell, which is an appropriate term. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it kind of fits with where you're starting to see other fields going. I was just talking to a friend a couple days ago about the term analytics engineer, for example. Like that's a new one, and the notion is that analysts should write reproducible code, and so that we'll see how that goes. Again, I kind of have mixed feelings with that too, because on one hand, I think it makes sense. On the other hand, it's depending on the type of analyst you're talking about, it might be an uphill battle to kind of get them out of entrenched patterns and so forth. But it's the same battle you're fighting, honestly. It sounds like so.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I can totally identify with the analytics engineer movement based on the background that I mentioned earlier. I'm a software engineer, design patterns, all the stuff that you're talking about, layered architectures, separation of concerns, all that jazz. I get it all. Business people don't care.
Right.
They don't care. And if my goal, which it is to say, look, I want to increase data literacy in business folks, professionals that are outside of the technical realm, I need the lowest barrier of entry possible. And talking to them about reproducibility is not part of that. So I'm just saying, look, I got to take Excel as it is, teach them how to do great analytics in Excel. Yes. Is it ideal from a purely reproducibility architectural perspective? No, it's not. However, I would rather have them do the analyses in Excel than not do them at all. So I'm like, just embrace Excel the way it is, show them how they can use it to do analyses, raise their level of data literacy. And once they start seeing the power of analytics, this is my hypothesis, once they see the power of it, they'll be more willing to be like, it'd be really cool if I could actually incorporate some of these reproducibility and architectural concerns, if I can incorporate that into my work.
So after somebody has become proficient in Excel, like, do they go into SQL or R next? What's your opinion on that?
So my opinion is first and foremost, um, start with Excel, learn those four things at base, learn them well, learn how to apply them to business problems, get analyses, get some traction, get some ROI. And then if it's time to graduate, next thing up is SQL, because Excel and SQL are like chocolate and peanut butter. They're better together. Some people are going to, if they're watching this, they're probably going to freak out. They'll be like, Jesus, Dave, what are you talking about?
That's heresy.
You're talking about, exactly. Imagine that coming from me.
Right.
You're talking about embedding SQL into an Excel workbook? Yes, because everything I mentioned earlier, right? I want to lower that barrier. But that's a step. It's an incremental step, right? Rather than just embedding everything in Excel, at least they've got the SQL code. They can pull it out of the embedding and then like put it in a Sprock or put it in another tool. So that's a chunk of reusability. So we're stair stepping them up the chain. And the great thing is that if you have Excel skills, learning SQL is actually very, very easy. And I have a whole blog series on that on my website, daveondata.com, where people can go learn SQL for free. And it's very, very easy if you know Excel, because at base, Excel is just all about working with tables of data. What's SQL about? Working with tables of data. So logical operations you do in Excel, you do in SQL, and they map conceptually. It's very easy. And you just start stair stepping them up. And then eventually you say, well, you know what? Maybe you can get all the way to R, because guess what R is all about? Working with tables of data.
Right. Yeah, and I guess on the SQL note, like, what are some baseline skills you think somebody should have to be proficient as an analyst in SQL?
Yeah. And so my answer is going to be nuanced, because I'm going to respond in what I believe, based on my experience, is useful for an arbitrary professional to get stuff done, versus like, what do you need to land a job with this particular type of title? Because those are sometimes two entirely different things. So focusing on what are the most useful aspects of SQL for professionals that are interested in getting data work done in their job. Now, granted, this is a subset of the other thing, so it's not wasted effort by any means. So obviously you need to be able to write joins, because you need to be able to join tables of data. You need to be able to write reasonable SQL code. So you need to know about subqueries and why they're evil. And you use CTEs, common table expressions, instead.
Amen.
Exactly. Case when, obviously, is case when's a good one. Group by, which is essentially is the SQL version of a pivot table. Group by, case when, working with dates, which is pretty useful in Excel as well. So a lot of that translates as well. Um, those are the ones off the top of my head. Oh, window functions, definitely window functions. So row num, for example, is a window function, and it's covered in the blog series that I talked about, by the way. And those things are really the stuff that's maximally useful in my experience as a hands-on analytics professional. And there's a bunch of other stuff that you would need to know if you were like going to go apply for a data scientist or an actual formal data analyst role that had SQL requirements. There's more than that, but that subset that I just talked about, I mean, you're using that 80% of the time when you're just like saying, look, I need to pull data from the database, massage it, manipulate it, bring it out into Excel so that I can analyze it. That's basically the gist of what you need.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Those points as well. Sort of the list of stuff that you mentioned there. It's, and then once you done SQL, I mean, why stop there? Why? So you're going to go to R next, and then
That would be my suggestion. Yes.
right. So
so
but walk us through that.
yeah. So I have a blog post that I wrote a while back, and I've also every now and then I post it up on LinkedIn as well, of this big decision tree flowchart kind of thing where it's like R versus Python, because that's what everybody wants to know. And generally speaking, if you look at the content that I created, even though I'm an R guy, most of the destinations are Python these days, because that's just the hot ticket. So it really depends on what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, if you're a business professional and you're interested in just being a business professional, I should say just, you're totally happy with your career trajectory in the business. You're not interested in being a data scientist or a data analyst or machine learning engineer or whatever. You want to be a data literate, analytically driven business professional. I am fully convinced that R is the quickest and easiest path for you. And the reason for this is simple. And I've written code in Python and in R and C++, and as you well know, COBOL back in the 1800s.
Yep.
So
it's a great language. That's a fourth step after you learn R. It's COBOL. So
right, copybooks. Yes. So I've written lots of code and lots of computer languages over my time, programming languages in my time, and I honestly believe that R is just easier for business professionals with no technical background to pick up. And it's just fundamentally the difference between R and Python, if you want to think of those as the two options. Python was built by computer scientists to be a general purpose computer language. Mm-hmm. And they bolted analytical capabilities on top of it, just like you see in Java and C++ and C# and all those other languages, which is cool. But still fundamentally, it was built as a general purpose object-oriented programming language, which means intrinsically there's that learning curve implicit in using it. Whereas R was built by statisticians for statisticians, which means that a computer scientist thinks the syntax is ugly and funky. I know I did the first time I looked at R.
Same. Still do.
But it's wildly useful for professionals with no technical background, no computer science background, because its focus is get analysis done as fast as possible with the least number of keystrokes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree too, and this is coming from a Python guy. I mean, we just, last night we had our I think 7th or 8th anniversary of our Python meetup, for example. So
nice.
Yeah, it's fun. It's it's been kind of fun watching the language, I guess, progress over the years from basically being a non-data language into being like the preeminent data language. But that being said, I do agree completely that R is actually an easier language to get into if you're just doing data. I still use it quite a bit for kind of as a hand calculator for stats, because it's just, you don't have to import anything, right? Or very rarely do you kind of just get up and go. In Python,
ML in a formula, you're good.
Right. Like, yeah, linear models it's like a first class citizen, and like t-tests and all this other stuff, right? Whereas in Python, it's, you gotta keep your dependencies up and ongoing, and Python isn't known for being the most friendly language for dependencies either. It's actually a giant pain in the ass. So, uh, I think R is just, I do agree with that approach. And it's kind of funny too, because I still see these kind of language wars going on, and I'm kind of like, at some point you should probably learn both. I mean, because if you're doing deep learning, for example, Python is just, you're going to be using that. It's not a question, right? Because you got PyTorch and TensorFlow.
And
And
if you're doing any sort of intensive production software engineering with a team where you guys are like in the same code base, I'd be the first one to say, look, Python is definitely going to be better for you than R. But generally speaking, so much of analysis is not about hardcore software engineering. It's about,
right.
I'm going to write a notebook or an R Markdown, or I'm just going to write a script, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're a business professional, more than likely you're working in a solo analyst kind of role anyway. So that stuff doesn't matter. You just
Right.
need to get speed to insight is what you need mostly.
Mm-hmm.
R is great for that. If for no other reason than the data frame syntax in R compared to working with pandas, it's if you've only ever worked in Excel, you're gonna look at pandas, you can be like, iLock, what the hell is that? Right? And you're like, you look at Excel and you're like, to data frames in R compared to Excel, you're like, okay, I can understand that. And like I have content, I have a whole free mini course that essentially shows all of the how close the code in Excel, right? You go into a cell and you type equals and you type in some stuff, and then you compare that to the same line of code in R, and they're basically the same. Maybe a couple little syntactical differences, but they're basically the same. You
Right.
compare that to pandas, no, not happening.
That's
Not that there's
interesting.
anything wrong with pandas. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I don't want any hate mail from the Python folks, okay?
So Dave Langer's email address is yeah, but in all seriousness, it is interesting kind of seeing the evolution of these data languages as well. I recently started dorking around with Julia, and I think that's perhaps the next phase. It's hard to say. I mean, I also saw a language survey where Julia had actually kind of gone down in popularity, if I was reading it correctly. So it's hard to say, and it doesn't have a lot of packages or the maturity level either R or Python has. But I did think that it was kind of a cool approach where they were taking a kind of a math first language, but making it highly scalable, which at a certain point Python certainly isn't at all either, right? So and as R is the same way. It has just there is like a certain asymptote where it kind of is what it is. I mean, you can kind of drop down into C at some point and just use those bindings, but still, it's like
Zap.
Julia just solves that. What's that?
Zap, exactly what I was going to say. Is like Python, R, a lot of these languages that are hot right now, deep down inside, anything that needs to be done fast is usually written in C or C++.
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
they've just abstracted it with Python or in R, and but deep down inside there's C and C++.
Yeah, I mean, I could see a time when I know Python's hot right now. I mean, my personal brand is somewhat associated with Python, but I can see a day when something else takes its place. It'll happen. That's just kind of the nature of things. So
Yeah, back in the 2000s, C++ was my jam. I wrote C++. I taught C++ classes at community colleges in the Seattle area. And in the late 2000s, the attendance on the classes I taught at the community colleges went because it was Java and C Sharp. And C++ kind of fell out of favor. And then you and I were talking before we started recording about Scala, right? That for a while
yeah,
Scala was like the hot thing, and you don't hear much about that anymore.
no, that one's going away as far as I can tell. Like even all the Apache frameworks that had used Scala, when they started including other languages, Python and R for Spark, for example, and I mean PySpark is literally a pip install in Python now, so it's kind of clear where the gravity had went. And then you're starting to see stuff like Rust as well. I mean, I'm fascinated by that language and the movement of that. I mean, it's supposed to be faster than C or C++, which is kind of weird. Maybe not weird, but it's cool. So I mean, but I could, if it ever got some traction in the data community, I mean, that'd be interesting to see. But it's going to take a long time just because there's been a lot of adoption with R and Python right now, and so and I guess I think back to your your original point too. It's kind of like, what do you need? Most business analysts don't need a high performance language. They just need to get answers, and R is perfectly suitable for that. So,
Yeah. And as we discussed, right, then there's the granddaddy of them all, which is SQL.
hmm
See, I've been writing code. Well, I guess technically I've been writing code since I'm 12, so that's a long time. But professionally, I've been writing code for more than 20 years, and the only constant has been SQL
hmm
that whole time. And I believe it's there's a simple reason for it. When you work with data, the tabular representation, because of the limitations of the human brain or whatever, is natural. Ergo, SQL is great because it is a declarative language that works with tables of data, so it's kind of universal. So I think that that's why I always stress SQL before R and Python, unless you have a very good career reason why you need to go there
hmm
first, because SQL it's the lingua franca, right? It allows you to scale. We were talking about Snowflake before we started recording, right? SQL works with Snowflake. SQL works with SQL Server. SQL works with Hive on Hadoop.
hmm
Works with Spark. It works with basically every data store worthy of note. I mean, there's some NoSQL variants where maybe it's not going to work very well, but generally speaking, most enterprises, it's still so much of the data that business people care about are still in just good old fashioned relational databases. So SQL is
Yep.
like, it's the lingua franca. You can't go
Yeah.
wrong by learning it.
And you ignore it to your detriment, I think, too. Uh, I mean, if you don't have good SQL skills, I mean, that's a serious handicap for a data professional. And it's true, too. I mean, we did a video on this, Matt and I, my business partner, on Monday for our Monday morning data chat, just talking about the NoSQL and SQL and sort of where it fits in 2021. And it's kind of funny because NoSQL for, I think a good part of the 2010s was people had kind of written it off, I would say, almost in a hipster kind of fashion. Like, oh, well, like everything's just going to be, these, esoteric NoSQL databases and so forth. And what's been interesting to see is SQL's come back with a vengeance. I don't even think it went away, frankly. I just think there was like a lot of noise over here because, even if you look at language indexes, it's not like SQL ever actually went anywhere. In fact, it
No.
grew. So, and all these NoSQL databases, like several of them have actually introduced SQL Lake syntax so you can interoperate with them just because, if you're going to have to learn some crazy NoSQL language, for every single dialect and database, that's painful.
Yeah. And
So,
I, and to your point, and maybe I'm a bit jaded, I guess, maybe, or opinionated, or both.
no.
Imagine that. Uh, like what I always thought was interesting was like when Hadoop first came out, and Hadoop was like the thing, right? It was all like everyone was learning Java, everyone was learning MapReduce, and then what did Facebook do? Facebook said, you know what? We really need to slap some SQL on top of this if we really want to democratize and make all this data flow and deliver value to the organization. So they built Hive. And then you see like the chart, you see it go, the workloads. At one point I saw years ago a diagram of like what percentage of workloads on a Hadoop cluster were pure MapReduce versus Hive. And it was like this.
hmm
Hive was like a thing because everybody knows SQL and it's so useful.
Well,
It's
yeah,
so
and I mean, I
easy.
don't know if you ever tried writing MapReduce,
Oh yeah.
but it sucked. I didn't like it at all. Hive was nice, and then Presto came out and it made it a lot faster and so forth. And um, yeah, it's kind of funny too. I've actually had conversations with the guys who actually wrote Hive and then later Presto, and it was all just because they were trying to scratch an itch internally, right? Where the analytics teams with these companies, namely Facebook, just needed widespread adoption
Hmm.
to query all this data, and Hive is a good first step. Then another team's like, well, that's great, except it's kind of slow, so we'll make it better. And but they always had SQL as a consideration. I don't think there was ever a point where they're like, oh, let's just make our own language on this. So it's
Yeah.
because it
Yeah.
kind of
So
knew.
my understanding anecdotally was that Facebook was like their data scientists didn't want to learn Java and MapReduce. They just wanted like, I want to be able to work with the data and get a result so that we can push the business forward.
hmm
And they're like, cool, we'll give you a SQL interface on top of it. Yes, it'll be slow. It's all still going to be batch, but you know what? You can run it at scale. Fire off your Hive job and then like go home for the evening or go grab lunch or whatever. And when you come back, you got your results.
Oh yeah, and even nowadays things like Kafka, right? I mean, like HeySQL. I mean, so you can just do SQL and streams, and if you're in AWS, you can do that with Kinesis as well. And I think it's just, it goes to show just the sticking power of it. I mean, it's just, I think we talked about this before. It's this thing called the Lindy effect where, at a certain point, this applies to technology where after a certain point, like something that's been around for a while is probably going to be around a lot longer, right? So when you think of that, you think of like bash commands, for example, probably PowerShell at this point too. And then SQL, so things that will probably just never go away. Ever.
Yeah, never been a fan of PowerShell, and I even worked at Microsoft.
Yeah, I was about to ask what your opinion on PowerShell was. I wasn't sure if that's going to be traumatic for you, or you're going to have glowing reviews about it. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I like a lot of Microsoft technologies. I'll completely admit that. I grew up in the Seattle area, so Microsoft is it's a big deal there. PowerShell, yeah, not so much.
What I find kind of cool, I have actually a Windows 10 computer. I'm normally a Mac guy, but I've been really impressed actually with Linux on Mac with WSL2. That's awesome. To the point where I could have considered just using the Windows as my primary machine. That's until Apple unveiled the M1 processor, at which point I was like, screw it, I'm just going to get one of those because it looks fun. So I did, and it's really fast. But I still use my Windows laptop, I'd say, quite often, and it's an enjoyable experience being able to do both. I think it's funny because Microsoft's gone. It used to be this Microsoft. I think that in the dev world, especially in the 2010s, recently, I would say until the last few years, like it was kind of like the business mullet of technology companies. I mean, it was like
IBM in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it's there, but it's not the cool thing. It
runs everything, but it's not cool.
They've been kicking ass lately, though, in terms of making themselves cool. Like VS Code is awesome. I use that as my IDE right now, and I love it. I mean, they freaking hired Guido van Rossum from the creator of Python to come work at Microsoft. Which, I had a friend who went to Microsoft to be a Python developer advocate. I think back like 5 years ago or something, and I was like, "You're crazy. Why would you go there?" I'm stupid. So
yeah, let's not even talk about what his stock's probably worth now, right?
Right. Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah. So anyway, on that tangent, just I've been really impressed by Microsoft, and
yeah, and I think, and this is my own personal opinion, so take it for what it's worth. Microsoft was very IBM-ish for a long time in terms of like, we are going to protect the crown jewels, the cash cows of the business. We're not going to necessarily embrace cool technology. But once Azure came into the fore, and you're like, look, we monetize through selling memory and compute. We don't care what you run, but this is what we make money on. Then you don't really care anymore, right? You don't care if it's Linux or this or that or the other thing.
right.
As long as you're running it on Azure servers in the cloud, that's how the company makes money. So they don't really care as much anymore.
No, and my prediction is, and I work with all the clouds, on a partnership level, and I suspect that Azure is actually going to be the biggest cloud when everything's said and done, just because the number of companies out there that are running Windows workloads, typically on on-prem servers, guess who makes it really easy to migrate those workloads to the cloud? Azure. If you're using, especially Windows 10 Pro, I mean, and we have Visual Studio. I mean, Azure is a first-class citizen in these tools. You can click a button and deploy, and it's really familiar. We're starting to see a lot of this actually in my business, where more and more companies we're talking to are making the leap to the cloud, and it's Azure. So
yeah. So when I left Microsoft in 2016, at the end of 2016, SQL Server alone was like a $4 billion business, and that's the vast majority of that was still on premises.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about all that. That stuff's just not going to get ported to another database engine. That stuff's going to get migrated to the cloud as is, and it still hasn't been done yet in bulk. Most of it's still running on prem.
Well, yeah, especially now that Microsoft sort of kneecapped a lot of the the other two cloud providers with the licensing stuff. I mean, it's kind of funny. AWS actually had this announcement at their reInvent conference. They're like, I can't remember what it was called, but you could port your SQL Server into a Postgres database or something like that, and you could write SQL Server syntax, I think T-SQL in Postgres. That was kind of interesting, but it was to me, it was more of a recognition that just the friction that Microsoft had introduced, and if you're gonna, but if you're a DBA at these companies moving into the cloud, you could do it that way with the Postgres stuff, or you could just port it into Azure SQL Server, right? And I think SQL Server has like I can't remember the stats or if they're accurate, but I think it was like 13 or 14% market share of the database, and access was like another 14%, which is kind of crazy.
Oh God, access still. It doesn't surprise me. I'm just laughing because I remember back in the 2000s, I had to support a production access application that had reached 2 gigs, and it was like,
Oh boy, wasn't that the limit of access back then? Was it?
it was, and it would
Yeah.
start to corrupt. So you'd have to purge stuff out of it to keep it under the limit. So I'm just laughing because of that. But yeah, I saw a stat where SQL Server was the 3rd most popular database engine. MySQL was first, then Postgres, and then SQL Server.
Mm-hmm.
And make no mistake, right? If you work for a big company that's been around for a long time, there's SQL Server all over the place.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we see this a ton. It's sometimes like kind of a polyglot mix. You might have a MySQL, some open source stuff, but yeah, inevitably there's like a SQL Server like laying around somewhere, and they're paying for it, right? So
and Oracle too. Let's be honest.
and Oracle, yeah,
and Oracle,
and Oracle. That's also there. So I don't know that Oracle Cloud's going to be as popular as the others, but time will tell. We'll see.
Yeah, I don't really hear much about the Oracle Cloud. GCP, AWS, and Azure. That's all I hear about usually.
Mm-hmm. I think there's been some talk about Oracle and like egress fees and bandwidth fees maybe being lower. But I mean, Zoom, I think, sort of brought that to everyone's attention when they moved to Oracle, because it was a big head scratcher for the tech world. They're like, why did you do that? But I don't know. Money talks.
Yeah, I mean, it's to your point. If you're the Microsoft sales rep, you've got a good story to talk to the CIO about. If you're like, hey, you need to move your stuff to the cloud, guess what? You can just lift and shift.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to necessarily use our managed services right away. You can just lift and shift. It all works exactly the way you think, and we know how everything works, and we can keep you covered. And by the way, we won't tell you this, but we got this slush fund just in case your project goes awry. We can dip into that to like fix it for you too.
Mm-hmm. In the data warehousing world too, I mean, in Azure, what we're seeing is companies are testing out Synapse, which is a newish data warehouse in Azure, or Snowflake, and it's usually those two, and it's sort of a coin toss of which one. But I mean, that's the direction it's going. So it's also fascinating because a lot of these companies have on-prem data warehouses, usually in SQL Server, and those are getting ported over to the cloud now, and which I think is great because it's going to be a lot more scalable and probably more performant. But because inevitably, like we come in to help rescue companies from like the SQL Server data warehouse that's about to keel over. So because it worked at one point and then it stopped really working. So
yeah, so what? Going back to something you mentioned earlier, I'm really curious about that. So what's the AWS story for the whole SQL Server stack? Because I'm used to enterprise environments, even outside of Microsoft, where they're running SQL Server, but they're also running SSAS, right, for their queues.
Yeah.
SSRS, SSIS. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem around the SQL Server.
Yeah.
stack. How do you port all that to like Postgres? I don't know if they.
It's harder, man. Like I mean, I think all the clouds have like their variant of SQL Server, but the SSIS though and SSRS are like things that are going to keep you probably in Azure. Period. I mean, because you can port those in using like Data Factory into Azure, and it's just like given the choice. Because in a lot of cases, these SSIS or SSRS jobs, it's kind of a rat's nest of code. I mean, you've probably seen these. And for somebody
I might have written them.
Yeah, so it's all Dave's fault. And to unwind these and kind of unpack them and maybe refactor them, I mean, that's a serious effort. So most of the time, if you can help it, most companies are just going to say, well, not it, and they'll just move it into the cloud and be done with it. Because, I mean, if it works, even though it's a rat's nest, I guess it works in the cloud. Longer term, I would suggest maybe looking at your pipelines, but the other clouds, to my knowledge, don't have anything comparable right now. I mean, so that's a huge selling point. If you're, and it's, talking about gateway drugs earlier, it's just SSIS now is like the gateway drug into Azure because it's unless you want to refactor everything, which you can do too, and you might want to, but just because you should doesn't mean you're going to. So
Yeah, because I could imagine like somebody in IT going to a business person and saying, okay, you know that workflow you got where you've got an Excel workbook hooked up to an SSAS cube and you can slice and dice the data any way you want. We're gonna have to like take that away from you.
right.
Like, whoa.
Yeah, and all the
Not gonna
infrastructure
happen.
too, man, like SharePoint, everything else too. I mean, it just kind of works up there, right? So, I mean, and it's just it's stickiness. It's like I said, again, we work with all the clouds. I think we have a lot of respect for everything each of the clouds are doing. But at the end of the day, like, if you're just running kind of your traditional blue chip IT operation in Windows, I think it's a pretty good guess where you're going to be going.
Yeah,
So,
because the business people, I mean, we've talked about this so many times before. The business people don't care. They don't care about the technology. They care
mhm.
about getting their work done. And anything that makes it harder or slower, they're just not interested. So it's like, okay, just lift and shift it to Azure. Great. Could we save a few bucks by moving it to Oracle's cloud? Like, I don't care. I don't want to have to work. I don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of switching gears a bit, like, I guess, what are your thoughts right now on kind of the state of uh, learning data right now? I mean, I know when I'm on LinkedIn, for example, or we hang out a lot, it seems like there's a lot of people interested in learning data science and getting into the field. Uh, I guess, yeah. What are your thoughts around that? Maybe like some ways people could, I guess, be effective in that journey.
Yeah. So I think, as we've discussed many times before, and this won't shock anybody who's familiar with either your content or mine, is that there's a certain hype cycle to it, right? Data science is like the cool thing. It's the cool job. I've used the analogy before. It was like being a webmaster in 1999 was like the cool thing, right? In the first .com wave.
I actually had that job.
Yeah, there you go. Everybody wanted to be a webmaster, and there were schools that would teach you how to do it, no matter what your background was. Just like you have data science boot camps now. So there's that, and I don't want to dismiss it because data science and analytics, the power of data is a real thing. So I don't want to poo-poo that. But what I would like to talk about are like folks that are interested in using data to have business impact, whether they're business professionals that want to stay in a business professional role, or they're folks
Hmm.
that want to move into a formal analytics role. So the learning of data is going to be a little bit different across those two camps, because I'll be the first one to tell you that if you're a business professional that wants to learn how to use data to have more impact, what you need to learn is going to be completely different than the second group, because the hiring managers in the second group are going to be following all the hype trends. Whereas the first group can kind of pick and choose whatever they want to use based on how easy it is for them to pick it up and learn and how effective it is in their job. And for example, you don't need deep learning for the first group, but you might for the second group, depending on what you want to do. So I generally speaking say, look, for both groups, even though I tend to focus my content on the first, even for both groups, it doesn't hurt you to start with the same path that I propose, which is, once again, if you're totally brand new to the space and you don't have any technical background whatsoever, start with Excel, learn the basics. I have blog posts, for example, that shows how to get a copy of an ebook by Jim Frost, who is a great statistics writer. He has a very inexpensive ebook. It was like $15 last time I checked on linear regression, and it's all conceptual. Right? So you just don't worry about the linear algebra, don't worry about any of that stuff. Just focus on the concepts, and you can do that in Excel just fine with the analysis tool pack. Start simple with these techniques that are broadly useful, and then expand from there. And that's really what I would tell people to focus on, because in my experience, even though I can do some math and I can write, God knows I can write code, and I'm familiar with all that. In my daily work for the past 4 or 5 years, I've really used just a very small number of techniques the most of the time, and they're not all that complicated. And then if you're like, look, I really want to move into a formal analytics role, then do your research and then say, okay, well, I'm going to need to know this and that and the other thing to really move into it. But I think the secret to learning data to have business impact these days is actually, it's never been simpler because Excel does so much. And for a lot of people, it might be all the tool they need. You graduate into some SQL, then you can use the power of the database to help you out, right? You're a great example of like, you probably don't need a machine learning model, guys. You need a group by, right?
Yep.
SQL's good for that. And then you can move into R and you can do all kinds of things. You can do market basket analysis, you can do machine learning, you can do every statistical thing you can think of in R. And by the way, generally speaking, if you think of like statistical analyses, the superset of all those things that are available in R compared to other languages is it's crazy because you can basically do everything in R. There's a package for everything, every analysis you can think of. So, and then you can say, okay, look, if I want to be a data analyst, if I want to be a data scientist, that's my dream, that's my goal. Great. I have content that, of course, says, okay, if that's your goal, you probably should bite the bullet and learn Python and all these other things. But at the very beginning, you can get really, really far with a small number of techniques, and they're not difficult to learn.
One thing that comes up quite a bit with us too, we're in a few office hours chats, for example. Even when we do the Data Heretics show, we always get asked this question, like, how do I get a job in this industry, right? Like, I may have the skills now, and I need work. I mean, how do you typically approach an answer for that?
Yeah, and the answer is that it's hard, it's tough. First question I usually ask people is like, are you sure you want to be a data scientist? Because you could look into data engineering, right? There are so many jobs available in data engineering. Oh, and it also pays better, generally speaking, too.
Right.
By the way, did you know that? So let's assume that I do the data engineering pitch and they say, no, I really want to be a data scientist. That's what I want to do. It's tough because there's a lot of competition out there. And there's also a lot of confusion because there's a lot of hiring managers and organizations that aren't actually from analytics backgrounds. And they, quite frankly, they don't really know what they actually need. So they have all these inflated expectations. Not always, it's not universally true, but it is true in a large number of circumstances based on my own personal experience and talking to folks. So the answer that I always give is that, one, it's complicated. And two, you need to do research. You really need to target companies and roles and cross-reference where you can skills and experiences and then start building those, because it's really hard to say, I'm going to be the general purpose data scientist unicorn where I can plug in any company in any role anywhere. That's unfortunately, that doesn't work anymore. For example, if you want to work at Uber on self-driving cars, or you want to work at Google building cat video detectors, those are specialized skills, and you got to focus on the right skills and experiences to get those jobs. So that's what I always propose is like, look, target companies, target roles, cross-reference skills and experiences, and then start building those skills. And if you don't have a job to build those experiences, target your project portfolio to match those experiences and then go from there. And then, of course, content marketing, I'm a big fan of that as well, to start establishing your authority. It also helps you network. And as we all know, going in through the front door with just sending a resume to a big company is usually not a pathway to success.
Nah, it's, especially right now, like you say, it's hyper competitive with data scientists, right? Part of that, I think, is like the term data scientist as well has become very overloaded, with roles that were traditionally, a bit more nuanced, like BI analyst is now sometimes a data scientist because recruiters just, and also I think when you hired, you want the cool title, right? And so I remember for the last few years, especially analyst was sort of like a 4-letter word, like nobody wanted anything to do with that, and it's all like, well, but if I can be a data scientist, then I'll just feel better about my life or something. I don't know. And what's been interesting too, though, is I think it has gotten correspondingly harder to find jobs, whether you're an analyst or data scientist, precisely because now everyone's lumped in to the same category and it's not as nuanced. I think to your point, it's like every company's version of a data scientist is different. Facebook's different than, Waymo's, which is going to be different than like 10 cents. If you're working on the TikTok algorithm, for example, that's not going to be the same data scientist that's working on like some insurance company. It's not even the same thing. So
Absolutely. Yeah, 100% agree. And it's a good example that you brought up is the differences between like the FANG companies. Because a while back, I looked at a bunch of senior data analyst positions at Amazon and I cross-referenced all the experiences and the technology because I was just curious. And then I did the same thing at Facebook. And then I saw that their data scientist roles looked an awful lot like data analyst roles
yep,
at Microsoft. And then on LinkedIn, somebody who works at Facebook confirmed, yeah, Dave, they're basically the same thing. So it's like data analyst, data scientist, it all really depends on the situation, right? And then, as you indicated, if you want to work on the TikTok algorithm, what you need to know is completely different than if you're like working at Facebook and you're primarily analyzing the results of A/B test runs, for example.
yeah, yeah, and I'm fascinated to see where the kind of the hiring trends go over the next few years too, because I don't know your impression is on this, but I get the sense that there's definitely a glut of data scientists, especially beginner data scientists. I think over the last few years, it's been hyped up as the sexiest job of the 21st century, and data is a new oil, and blah 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 blah. And what's happened is, and countless material is out there on how to become a data scientist. I mean, books, courses, university classes, university degrees, even. And
Mm-hmm.
so and a lot of people are doing it. And talking about data engineering, I haven't seen it nearly as much push into that, even though, I just put a post today on LinkedIn where it's like, I'm hit up like several times a week by companies asking if I know of anybody who's, a data engineer who's looking for work. And I'm like, maybe, but probably not, just because it is what it is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and that reminds me of years ago when Spark was first hot. Even then, the salaries for Scala developers working on Spark, essentially building data engineering pipelines, was way higher than data scientists, right?
mm-hmm.
So if I'm not saying that you have to be money motivated, but money, we all need it, unfortunately, I guess, in this world. So if it's any sort of consideration, expand your horizon. And the other thing that I find too is that, based on my experiences, when people ask me about this, like through LinkedIn direct messaging or something like that, I say, look, have you ever considered not going technically focused, right? Because a lot of data science these days is around writing code and building models and putting them in production and all that kind of thing. And we have the whole ML engineer versus data science thing, but let's
Mm-hmm.
not worry about that for the second. Versus like, have you thought about sticking or moving into the business, but being a data enabled business professional? Because I see so much opportunity there. And I'll give one example: digital marketing.
Mm-hmm.
There is so much money wasted in digital marketing. And the potential for you to use data potentially to substantively affect the business in a positive way is very, very high. And you know what? Those kinds of people end up getting rewarded big time.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's so true. And also it's I think there's this assumption that if I have like cool data science skills that I can just kind of plug in anywhere, right? But I think to your point, having domain expertise is huge. I think it's underrated, even though it should be. I actually think domain expertise coupled with data literacy is a very powerful combination.
Yeah, because I've been doing a series of posts, one a week for the past few weeks on LinkedIn, which essentially takes three analytical techniques: the process behavior chart, linear regression, and the mighty random forest. And I map them to business questions that you could use and use those things to answer if you were an HR professional, if you were a marketing professional, if you were a product management professional. Next week, I'm going to do marketing.
Nice.
And those relatively simple techniques that aren't very sexy at all, in the blogosphere or on the LinkedIn
Mm-hmm.
feed and all that kind of stuff, are broadly applicable. And what makes them powerful is the domain expertise that you talked about. Right? It's not the actual technique itself that makes it powerful. It's using it in the context of a particular domain that makes them actually valuable, which is where I believe personally that the future of data science and analytics, or data mining, whatever you want to call it, really is more on the business side of the equation than it is on the technical side of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. Well, cool. I think coming up on time, but as always, it's fun to talk, and we'll have to do this more often. So,
Yeah, as
um,
often as you want. I'm good.
yeah,
I'm good to
awesome.
go.
What if somebody wanted to find out more about you? How would they find out about you?
Yeah. So that's pretty easy. Davondata.com, all one word. That's my website. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. I am very, very active on LinkedIn. You can also go into YouTube and just type David Langer into the search bar in YouTube, and I think I still think I'm the first one that comes up. Or you could type in David Langer and data science into the YouTube search bar, and I will definitely come up first. Those are three easy ways to find me and get in touch with my content.
Awesome. Yeah, and keep cranking it out, man. You're doing some great work, and I'm really happy for you that you are finding success and traction with all the content you're producing. So it's inspiring to me. Hopefully it's inspiring to others as well. So
Yeah, I hope so. Because my whole goal is to be like, look, I don't care who you are, you can learn valuable data analysis skills, and that's what I create my content for, is to show you how you can do that.
that's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks, Dave. Until
All
next
right, thanks,
time.
Joe.
So yeah, we'll catch you later too.